we are at 30 minutes. I'm going to do my first test on the bread to see how done it is. I have the largest loaf out. It's not as done as I think it should be. It's not as brown. We're going to turn it right out of the pan. This is what the bottom looks like. Again, I don't think we're quite ready. I'm going to say we can easily go another 10 minutes. We're now at 40 minutes on bake time on the loaves, and let's see where they're at. Here's the larger loaf. Looking very brown on the bottom. Good on top. Let's see how it sounds. Sounds very good. I'll show you how I set that sideways on the pan. The pan's right here. And then I set the loaf sideways. Kind of use the pan as a cooling rack. Let's get out the smaller loaf. I'm sure if the larger loaf is good, this one is too. Sounds good. Let's take a look. Nice pretty loaf. Set that one up on the pan as well. Hi, I'm Cinda, for those of you who don't know, and I make a lot of bread in my kitchen all the time, like before the coronavirus, COVID-19 was really a thing. I've been making bread for about 20-25 years at home, so I wanted to go through that with anyone who's interested. And the recipe I'm going to be making today is house bread. I'll make sure and leave that available in a written format so that anyone who would like to can play along and make your own loaves. So the house bread is going to start out with 4 cups of an all-purpose flour. It doesn't have to be organic or any special brand. What I'm using right now is a Bob's Red Mill flour, and I'll give you a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm using a half cup measuring cup, so I'm going to have to measure out 8 half cups to make my 4 cups. So 3, 8. So what I'm doing is I scoop, the inside the cup is here, and I scoop up to level that off when I measure each cup, so it's packed and level and looks just like that before I dump it in. My larger bowl is in use right now in the fridge with apples in it, so we're going to try to make it in a much smaller bowl this time. See how that works out. Next, I'm going to add a cup of whole wheat flour. Just kind of gives the bread a little bit different texture and taste. And as I'm going here, I've kind of hollowed out a place in the middle like that. Next we have yeast. If you're using packet yeast, you can add a whole packet. I buy my yeast in bulk. I buy about a pound at a time of yeast, and that saves me a lot of money. And then I have a whole bunch of yeast to work with later. So add your packet of yeast, or 2 1/4 teaspoons. Go ahead and put that back in the fridge where it should live when you're not using it. on the list is our ground ginger. I add half a teaspoon of ground ginger. Spices or something else that I buy in bulk. I like to buy them a pound at a time. Organic when I can. And these came from, this ginger came from Star West. That's where I get a lot of my my herbs and spices from. Next is a tablespoon of sugar. This is a turbinado sugar that I've prepared in the food processor to make it more fine. You don't have to do that. You know, whatever sugar you have is fine. That's just what I have available, so that's what I'm going to use. Let some water warm up a little bit there. I'm a little short in this kitchen on measuring utensils, and so I'm going to use a pint jar, just a standard canning jar, to measure out my water, because I know I need 2 cups of water, and this holds 2 cups. Very convenient, right? So just under the rings measures out 2 cups of water, and I'm going to dump that right in the well here. All of that water that kind of overflowed just a little bit from my well, and that's okay. That's not a big deal. I'm going to go ahead and add my flax. You might have seen recipes that call for egg. If you don't want to use egg, maybe someone has an allergy for egg, or you like a vegan recipe instead, you can use flaxseed like an egg. So I'm going to measure out my 4 tablespoons, or if you have a 1/4 cup measuring cup handy, 4 tablespoons and a 1/4 cup are the same measurement, so you can save a little time that way if you like. I just kind of floated that on top, and I'm going to stop the video at this point and maybe 10 minutes or so let the yeast kind of do its thing and get frothy. Because I put the flax on top, you won't be able to see quite as well how frothy it gets, but it should look real nice and be ready to go in, like I said, about 5 or 10 minutes. Nothing wrong with going and doing another 5 or 10 minute project while you're doing that, or set a timer if you need to. So I'll see you then. I'm not sure if you'll get to see it or not. I wanted to take a video of the house bred ingredients in the bowl, waiting for the yeast to get frothy and be ready to make some dough out of this big bowl of ingredients. Sometimes you can actually see the yeast bubble and work, and I was hoping maybe to be able to catch this on video. I don't know if I will or not. Obviously, if I don't, I'll cut that from the video entirely, but I thought I'd at least give it a try. It has been about 9 minutes since we put all of the ingredients together for this bread. Let me see if I can tilt this just a little bit and show you kind of what that looks like. I don't think that's going to get a good enough view. I have gotten some video and pictures of the bread ingredients in the bowl right now. Sometimes you can see the yeast do things. It gets kind of frothy and it boils up. But yeah, I think this is ready to go and stir up and start forming the dough. So I'm going to go very carefully at this point because I really needed a bigger bowl for this, but we can make do with what we have. So I'm just slowly kind of scooping that towards the middle. It'll kind of look like a big mess for a little while. I don't want to make too big of a mess, but at the same time I'm not really hung up on the way it looks. I'd like to not wear it. I'd like to not slop it all out on the countertop. of my older versions of this recipe included whey. It's certainly not a mandatory part of the recipe, but if you have it or have access to it, it's fine to add. If you are a fan of cottage cheese or sour cream, both of those products typically have a little bit of whey separated on top. Sometimes yogurt will as well. You could add it straight from that if that's something that you have available to you and you'd like to. But it's really not a mandatory thing. Another thing I'll make a note of is that a lot of bread recipes call for salt. I've done a fair amount of cooking for individuals who are sensitive to salt and shouldn't have that in their diet, so I don't typically add salt. You can if you like. If you'd like to add salt, you can add anywhere from about a teaspoon of salt to a tablespoon of salt. I think that I've stirred that about all that I can in the bowl that we have. And I am actually, a lot of you know this, I'm very short, 5 foot tall, and it's hard for me to get in and knead well in the height of the countertop. So I'm actually standing on a stool right now to get in here and knead gently as I keep incorporating more of that flour in. And just kind of pushing that all together. This can be a great thing to do with kids. It can also be a very messy thing to do with kids, but you know, I think it's good for them to learn with us in the kitchen. Some of this is very, very soft and squishy. Again, I'm just trying to mix the ingredients together at this point. Particular batch is kind of working out a little bit on the dry side for me. There's a lot of flour left in the bowl yet. This is a sticky dough, at least at this point in the game. So I'm just kind of pressing down like this as I go. Pick the dough up and fold it like this, and then kind of the same thing again. Just a little bit of patience there. Sometimes I do this in my food processor. It speeds things up quite a bit. Not everybody likes to use a food processor for that. So I'm doing it by hand. It also makes a nice quiet video versus a big loud food processor in the middle of your video. It's not very calming. Set this out on my board. Try to clean my hands off just a little bit. This is kind of like the blob or every sticky, cementy, gluey kind of thing that you've ever handled, kind of all in one. Kind of try to take things slow and not panic or fling my hands. I certainly don't want to make a bigger mess. It might be good to note that I keep my fingernails fairly short when I'm going to be handling dough. It can be harder to knead if your fingernails are long, and it can certainly be harder to clean out of your nails later. I have a fair amount of flour that's still in my bowl. And I have the stuff that I cleaned from my hands. I'm going to go ahead and add just a tiny bit of water to that bowl. See if I can make that extra flour into more dough. Minimize my waste, maximize my bread and my time in making all this. So I kind of take bits of softer dough that is more moist and take that around the flour that's stuck to the edges of the bowl, and then I'll kind of clean up my bowl. You can almost entirely clean your bread bowl that way. And then I have this small piece of dough here that I will later incorporate into the rest of the recipe. So that's a good bit of dough there that I got out of that bowl. Following a recipe is great, but again, if you see for whatever reason you need to add a little more flour or a little more liquid, sometimes you just have to go ahead and do that. I'm back down off of my stool at this point. And I'm starting to turn the dough and knead it. Hop back up on my stool because I feel like I need a little bit more leverage on this dough. This is fairly stiff dough at this point, and that's a little tough for me to knead, so I'm just kind of putting my weight into it, almost like you see like a CPR video or something like that. I'm using the heel of my hand and my opposite hand for a little extra pressure. That makes it a lot more comfortable on me to be able to do this time and time again. That's another reason I like to use the food processor. If I'm making a lot of bread all the time, it can be hard for me to make a loaf every day, or even more than about 2 times a week. It can be hard for me to do that with my wrists. I just kind of try to take my time and keep turning the dough and kneading it. Another thing you can do if you find the dough is difficult for you to knead, you can either cut the recipe in half, or you can simply break the dough into 2 pieces and knead 1 piece of dough at a time, so that it seems like a little less work. Now granted, you have to do it for longer, but it can be easier if you break that down into a piece that's a little more manageable for you. Again, if you have kids who like to help you in the kitchen, you can also get some help from them and have them do it with you. That can be a great way to ease stress. It's kind of stress relieving. You don't want to punch it or be really rough with it, but still, this is pretty hard work. So I guess the big thing is I work slowly. There's a lot of pressure that I put on the dough, but I do that slowly instead of very quick. clearly gonna have to take a quick break from this. This dough is coming together nicely. It's starting to look more smooth and less ragged. That's exactly what we want. I'm going to rest it for just a moment and let my dog in who's barking. Continue on my kneading. So I used a towel to get the door so I don't have to worry about getting dough all over the door handle or having to stop and scrub my hands again. So if this is hard for you to knead, you can add less whole wheat flour, and more all-purpose flour, because the all-purpose flour will be much easier to knead. That's one of my reasons that whole wheat flour and whole wheat bread is not my favorite to make. It's just too hard for me to handle and knead. Starting to look a little more smooth. I'm going to do something that we call a window pane. I just kind of pinched off a piece of dough here. I'm going to stretch it out, and the goal is to be able to stretch it thin enough before it tears. See, this tore on me, right like that, but you should be able to stretch it out and see light through that dough before it tears, like a window pane. So I have a little bit more work to do with this dough before we're ready to let it rise the first time, or proof. Just continue to push and knead on the bread. Fold over. Another advantage to using the food processor, if you use the if you're doing one loaf worth of bread, you can actually mix it up in the food processor without kneading it by hand, and then leave it right in the food processor where it's warm from the action of the food processor and covered. You know, leave the lid on and it will rise and be ready for the next step. Closer on our window painting now. Let's see what we look like. I'm going to step down from my stool. See how our glutinous fibers are holding together. Not quite there. It's not absolutely mandatory that you get to the point that it will window pane. It does make such a nice loaf. kind of uses different muscles when I'm down here versus up on my stool. So a lot of times as I get tired at this point, I'll vary between the two. Let's try one last time. Let's see how this does. This is not something I may be able to show you easily, but it's at least starting to get there where I can see light through the thinnest portion of this dough before it tears. So I'm going to say that we are ready. So I'm going to shape this into a pretty ball. I want it to look nice and smooth. Roll that a little bit on my board. Add that back to my bowl, and it looks just like that. I'm going to pop it into the oven where the pilot light is on and let it rest for about an hour, and we'll be back then. So it has been nearly an hour since the bread has been rising or proofing in the oven, and while I'm waiting for that to finish up, I'm going to show you how to get the bread pans oiled. I'm using a tin or metal pan, and butter I think makes the best oil for the inside of the pan and keeps the loaf from sticking. So whenever it's available, I always use butter, and I mean real butter, not margarine, or you may think that it's butter kind of substitute stuff. I'm not a big fan of margarine. I don't think it works the same way in baking, so I like to butter that pan. I do kind of a messy job and add a little extra butter, and then you never have to worry about your loaf turning right out of that pan nicely. See how the butter is there? So there's one pan. I'm going to pre-soften this butter. It's not something you have to do, it's just something I did this time. Another thing you can do is use the wax paper that the butter comes in and get that little last bit of butter out of there, and use that to clean the inside of the pan and not necessarily get butter all over your hands. But what a problem, because butter. And I'm going to get the sides, pay attention to the corners and the bottom, and the edges. Just put a nice even layer of butter all around there. Another thing I'm going to do is hit the edges and the top, so that if the bread comes over the sides, it doesn't end up sticking there. That can sometimes be a little problematic. Here's this one. I'm going to go back and make sure I got the top on this loaf. Right like that. There we go. this is what our loaf looks like. Our dough looks like at this point. I'll leave the butter right on my hands, it won't hurt anything. And I touch it, and it wants to spring back just a little. That'll be good. This is called punching down. It just kind of deflates the dough. Pull that right out of the bowl. I did not add, some recipes say to add oil or butter to the dough. I did not do that. If I have a large enough bowl, I prefer to cover it. I can do things like take a large plate and cover that bowl. You could use a lid for the bowl, or sometimes saran wrap, or a towel. Sometimes a towel will stick. I don't always like to use a towel. So I'm going to knead the dough just a little bit. And then we'll form that, or cut that into 2 different balls of dough and form loaves and let them prove again. I try to be a little more gentle with the dough at this point. So I cut this into 2 pieces, about like that. They're fairly equal. They don't have to be perfectly equal. And so I'm going to start by kind of flattening out this piece. It's going to look roughly like a rectangle, like this. And I'm going to fold this kind of in thirds, fold this piece to the middle, and kind of pinch the edges here so that it'll stay down. I'm going to fold the opposite end to the middle. I'm going to do the same thing and go this way and fold that about to the middle. Pinch that down. And the same here, go to the middle. Pinch that down. And that's kind of what we look like right now. That's okay. It will lengthen kind of as we go, and I keep turning the opposite side in and work that to the middle, and it will shape a nice loaf. And the same thing here. Turn that opposite side in. Kind of pinch that down. The bottom's always going to look, I won't say ugly, that's not true. It doesn't have to look perfect and smooth. I kind of round the ends a little bit. Kneading and rolling, kind of elongating that a little bit. So this is the top of the loaf. There's the bottom. This is what the ends look like. Go ahead and set that in a pan. Kind of center that. I'll hold it up so you can see. It doesn't quite fill up the pan, and that's okay. Again, it will rise again, and it will fill up that pan. The same thing with this loaf. flattening that out. And I take the top and fold that in towards the middle. Flip that around. Do the same thing. Bring the top in towards the middle. Like sort of an envelope look. And taking the right end towards the middle. Work on pinching that down so it stays in place. And take the other side. I kind of turn that a little bit as I go. And bring that into the middle. You can kind of pinch those sides down. Turn it. This step will elongate your loaf. If you're making a very long loaf, like a French loaf, you could just keep going that way until it reached the shape and length that you wanted. Turn it again. That will create a nice loaf that will make a good sandwich for you. Or you could make something like a pretty French bread or French toast, or a bird's nest, or egg in the hole kind of recipe with that. Kind of think of things like you want a peanut butter and jelly sandwich that doesn't leak peanut butter or jelly out the top or the bottom of the sandwich. Shaping that out a little bit better, rounding the ends. And here's my second loaf. Looks like that. I'll turn it around. There's the bottom side and the ends. Again, the ends are not going to look especially pretty, and that's okay. And when I put it in my pan at this point, that's what it looks like. I'm going to set both of those loaves back in the oven again for about 45 minutes. Here we are at 30 minutes. I'm going to do my first test on the bread to see how done it is. I have the largest loaf out. It's not as done as I think it should be. It's not as brown. We're going to turn it right out of the pan. This is what the bottom looks like. Again, I don't think we're quite ready. I'm going to say we can easily go another 10 minutes. We're now at 40 minutes on bake time on the loaves, and let's see where they're at. Larger loaf, looking very brown on the bottom, good on top. Let's see how it sounds. It sounds very good. I'll show you how I set that sideways on the pan. The pan's right here, and then I set the loaf sideways. Kind of use the pan as a cooling rack. Out the smaller loaf. I'm sure if the larger loaf is good, this one is too. It sounds good. Let's take a look. Nice pretty loaf. Set that one up on the pan as well.